What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Welcome to Street Photography Breakdown Part 1. So I've been making these breakdowns of my compositions and photographs that I've been making over the past decade of working on my photography. And I'm very inspired to make these videos right now. So I'm just going to keep making these composition breakdowns, making these photo breakdowns as a way for me to flesh out my thoughts about photography and give you some advice and pointers that I wish I knew when I first started getting into street photography. And so without further ado, let's move right into example number 1. Mexico City Mural. And so here in Mexico City, I spent 2 weeks walking around the streets with my camera, and I was making photographs of the chaos of these different markets. And the thing about photographing in Mexico City is there is so much chaos, and it's so good for street photography. However, it's hard to isolate subjects from that chaos. And so what I do a lot of the times is fish at a scene and work back to front. And so this is a very prime example of me doing that, where I was drawn to this scene due to the mural in the background, right? That beautiful popping color. We have the gesture of the teeth, of the eyes, and the hand. There's that face on that mural, and it's very colorful and vibrant. And this drew me in. I set my stage. That was my number one first decision, was working back to front, setting my stage. I sensed the possibility of something here. Isolating a subject from that mural, because ultimately in these chaotic environments, it's very difficult to make a photograph that's easy to read when there's so much chaos going on. And so I decided to position myself at this choke point, at a place where there is light and shadow play. And as you can see here highlighted in yellow, we have that deep black shadow area that I was intrigued by underneath a bridge. And so because I put myself in this choke point where I knew that subjects were moving in and out of the scene, I have a clean background and I have this interesting dynamic between light and shadow play, all that was left for me to do was plug in something in the foreground. And so I waited as this man came through, delivering a package into the shadow area. He comes dragging these big looming bags on a cart, and as he was dragging them into the shadow area, his arms were outstretched in the light and his face and his body were crushed in the shadow. But I believe makes an interesting relationship between his crushed shadow, the hands and the gestures, in relationship to that mural in the background, to the face of the mural, to the hand on the mural. And it's just a very simple frame that I made in Mexico City, making this relationship very intuitively through positioning myself at a choke point, finding an interesting stage, working back to front, waiting in a place where there's light and shadow play, and then finally being triggered by a gesture and pressing the shutter. And so that was the very simple way in which I came home with this photo. Example number 2, we have this boy in Philadelphia, and this is a very intimate photograph that I made through a reflection of a boy gazing out towards City Hall. Or actually, no, he's gazing towards his mother inside. And so actually I had permission to make this photograph as I came up to the window as I was making frames, and the mother was there and we were waving, saying hi. I went inside and actually showed her the photograph. And so as I was making this photograph, I noticed very immediately that in order to create something strong and compelling, I had to make a physical decision, right? And so what do I mean by that? What do you mean physical decision? Essentially, photography, as much as it's a visual game of you seeing and perceiving the world, putting together the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, it's also a physical pleasure, and the physicality of photography, I believe, goes overlooked. And so I had to drop physically low with my camera in order to isolate and separate that subject from the background, as we have this beautiful triangle of light that was casted upon the reflection of the window. And I noticed that initially when I was making the photograph, but I noticed that through the physicality of me moving my body and adjusting my body in order to separate that boy's face from the chaos of the reflection. Because otherwise, if I were to shoot from an eye angle or shoot from a different angle, you wouldn't be able to see the boy's face. And so I very quickly understood that I needed to drop low to separate his face from the beautiful light and shadow play of the window in relationship to that sky in the background that gives him his clear gesture and facial expression. And so in the reflection, we have the Masonic temple, which was a beautiful touch that came naturally through me physically positioning my body. And so a lot of the compositional decisions that we make are physical when we're on the street. And I just wanted to emphasize that right here in this example, because I think that photography, it's this physical medium of moving your body and then pressing the shutter with your gut, and you respond by looking at life in front of you like a visual puzzle. But in order to solve that visual puzzle and fit this subject within that triangular puzzle piece, I needed to physically readjust my body in order to create this frame. And so example number 3, we have children in Zambia. And so I spent a year in the village working as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so I arrived in this particular village after a long bike ride. It was the beautiful golden hour. And I noticed these children playing upon this empty frame. And actually the first thing that I noticed in this moment was the shadow play. Light and shadow intrigues me. Youth playing and experiencing, their everyday life in the village is also very interesting. But I'm going to be frank. The first thing that I saw when I looked at this scene, of course, was the children playing. But I saw that shadow and I said, wow, that looks beautiful. And so I was drawn to that shadow play. And so once again, photography is a visual game and a physical pleasure where I then adjusted my body, right? This is important to highlight. I adjusted my body in relationship to this boy in the foreground and that shadow there on the right-hand side in the background. I was intrigued initially by the shadow play, but then I noticed this boy playing upon the empty frame, and I needed a strong foreground element to help tell the story, to help bring the photograph more visual and emotional impact. And so I simply positioned my physical body closer to that boy in relationship to the shadow on the right-hand side. And then everything else kind of just falls into place. We have all of these children playfully engaging at the scene on the right-hand side. And I made these very simple compositional decisions by relating my body in relationship to the foreground, middle ground, and background, being intrigued by the shadow play and the boy playing upon the frame. And so we have this beautiful thing that happens with spontaneity and intuition where light is out of our control. And I didn't necessarily predict that this boy's eye would be visible through the shadow play and light on his face. However, by understanding that there is potential for a photograph to make by looking at the beautiful background, by looking at the beautiful light and shadow play, I was able to sense something could happen here. I was able to see the way in which the boy was moving and grooving on this pole, and then eventually I pressed the shutter at that right moment where his eye was revealed. And so this just comes through following your gut, your intuition, and putting your body in a physical position where you can sense the possibility of something. And then ultimately we have this very strange relationship, actually. If you look on the right-hand side of the frame, we have this mural. There's an eye visible there on the right-hand side in relationship to the boy's eye on the left-hand side. And these are those little cherry on top moments that I believe come through just being there and being prepared to make the photograph. And then ultimately you come home and you're surprised by these little details and things that help tell the story. But once again, that's not necessarily something I observed with my naked eye. I didn't notice how I could make the photograph of the boy's eye coming through that shadow area. I didn't notice that mural there in the background. Once again, I was intrigued by a shadow, some children playing, some beautiful light. I positioned my body just right and press the shutter. And that's the truth of the matter, where we have this clean background of this tattered wall. We have those bricks visible above that wooden door. And we have a beautiful stage. We have a beautiful background to work with, where ultimately I look to make timeless photographs. I look to make photographs that have an ambiguous space to them, where it's not necessarily somewhere specific. And I have this, intention with my photography to simplify the frames as much as possible, right? As much complexity you see in this frame with the light and the shadow play and yada yada. I really try to make a photograph easy to read and visually impactful through simplifying and subtracting all the superfluous details and putting my subjects upon a clean backdrop. And so that's how this photograph was made. The children in Zambia. This is one of my favorites. And so example number 4, we have 15th and Chestnut Street here in Philadelphia, a hot spot for street photography in Philadelphia. This is a great location. And so here we have this beautiful light and shadow play. Once again, I'm always drawn to that golden hour, that golden light. This is one of my favorite times to shoot. And what I did here at this particular moment was I simply positioned my physical body once again in relationship to this beautiful looming shadow area where we have all these crushed shadows. We have the beautiful tall skyscraper in the background. And one thing in particular that I was interested in is the light on the left-hand side reflecting off of that beautiful window frame. And so I have this backdrop filled with shadow and light. And so I know that as people move in front of me, they will be illuminated within the light against that backdrop of shadows. And so the subject came to me, he started making photographs. It was some stranger with a compact camera, and I just started making pictures of him. And so this is me embracing the spirit of play and not taking myself so seriously, right? So this guy came up to me as I'm fishing and I'm waiting at this scene to make a photo, and he started making a photo, and I said, "Oh, cool camera," and I started making a photo of him taking a photo of me, and then we just had this like very quick and spontaneous interaction at the scene. And then he moved on, and I was waiting as I made a photo of him for other people to enter the frame. And so then finally we have this man on the left-hand side looking back at me with his half face covered in shadow, illuminated in the light. And it adds this extra layer to the frame that I believe really is the cherry on top. And so a lot of the times when you're at a scene, it's really important to stay patient and playful. And so when I made this particular photograph, that's exactly what I did. I positioned myself at a choke point where I understand people are moving in and out of this corner. It's a very heavily trafficked location during the golden hour here in Philadelphia. And so I come here pretty much every single day in the summertime. And so I position myself in relationship to the background. I have my composition locked in. I'm looking at that window. I'm looking at the way the sky and the light is reflected on that window on the left-hand side. I'm looking at the way the building is looming in the middle of the frame in relationship to that blue sky. I have this clean backdrop with black shadow area. I have people moving in and out, illuminating in the light. And then all I was waiting for was my subjects. All I was waiting for was something interesting to happen here. I was just patient and playful, and things aligned. And so example number 5, the last example, we have workers in Mumbai. And so I spent about a month in Mumbai exploring all throughout the busy markets and different locations throughout this vibrant city. I actually have a playlist on my YouTube channel where I do a 2-hour POV behind the scenes series photographing in Mumbai, where you can see how these photographs were made. So please feel free to check that out. Anyways, here at this market, I was making some photographs, and once again, similar to the way in which I was discussing the Mexico City markets, there's almost too much chaos in these markets to make a clean frame. However, what I noticed when I saw these men lugging these big boxes and loading up this truck was the way in which the man there, highlighted in red on the right-hand side, was easily visible against that blue sky. And so again, photography is a visual game. It's like visual problem solving. And in order for me to solve this visual puzzle, I made sure to position my body in relationship to that man there on the right-hand side and the background, filling him like the missing puzzle piece that goes perfectly in between that empty gap of the blue sky. And then finally we have all of these gestures, right? We have these gestures that fall through naturally. I'm watching and observing human behavior. I'm looking at the patterns of the people and the way that they move from left to right over and over again, working the scene, staying patient. I didn't just make one snapshot and move on. Right? This comes through patience and persistence and being there and being present when I press the shutter, being aware of where I have to position my physical body in relationship to these gestures, you know? A lot of these lucky moments where there's lots of gestures and things and dynamics and complexity going on comes through actually being hyper aware of what's going on and being present and looking at the gestures and following through with making more photos than less. And so I encourage you to work the scene in order to come home with a clean photograph that has a lot of things going on. Where here we have a lot of different elements like these boxes and the blue sky, and these backdrop elements help tell the story, but ultimately the interest is within the gestures of the people and the way that they're moving and their hands, and they're all outstretched and interesting in their own ways. And you know, these kind of frames where there's lots of complexity and different elements going on are, I believe, you know, actually easy to achieve. I think it's overwhelming when you look at an example or you look at different photos that you want to try to make, and you know, or you're inspired by and you want to try to make photos like this or something. But you know, once again, it's a very physical thing, and it's also a mental game of patience. And you know, if you see a scene unfolding and you see these men, you know, loading these boxes, and you know, there's so much going on, it's like, okay, well, there's just so much going on. How do you make sense of the chaos? Right? Like that's what all photography is. It's articulating the unknown, putting order to the chaos in your frame, right? But how do we do that succinctly and consistently? You know, you do that through looking at the world like a visual problem for you to solve. You look at the people in front of you as actors upon a stage, and you set your stage, you set that backdrop, You position your body, you drop low if you need to, you fit that puzzle piece on the right-hand side against that backdrop, and then you wait as things align. You watch as the things happen in front of you, and you're simply patient, and you're observant, and you're following through, and you're clicking the shutter over and over again as people move and gesture, and you're triggered by those gestures, and then over time, through consistency, discipline, and going out there each and every day and practicing your photography, you can come home and make some frames like this. And so hopefully some of the things I said in this video inspire you or motivate you to go out there and make some photographs. I hope that you learned something today. If you want to learn more, please feel free to visit dantesisofo.com. You can find more information on street photography there, where I break down more photographs and ideas about the medium. So thank you once again for watching today's video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.